I got home earlier than usual that day because the office had a power outage. Instead of waiting around for them to fix it, I decided to call it a day. I was in a good mood, even humming some old song as I pulled into the driveway. Emily didn't know I'd be home this early, so I thought it'd be a nice surprise. Maybe we could order takeout and watch that trashy reality show she loves. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, something felt off. There was a black sedan parked right in front of the house. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place where from. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably someone visiting the neighbors, but something gnawed at me. I stood there a second longer than usual, keys in hand, trying to shake the unease creeping up on me. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the sound hit me immediately, a voice, low and unfamiliar, coming from the living room. My body stiffened, and I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. That wasn't Emily's voice. I shut the door quietly behind me and made my way down the hallway, my footsteps almost silent on the wooden floor. I stopped just before the living room, and that's when I heard her. Emily's laugh. Not just any laugh, though, it was that laugh. The one that used to be reserved for me, the one that was warm and real. But now it felt stolen. She was laughing with him. His voice was deep, casual, with the kind of familiarity that told me he wasn't a stranger. I peeked around the corner, and there he was. It was Eric, her boss. He was lounging on my couch, his arms slung over the back, inches from where she sat. She had on that damn red dress, the one I used to love, the one I hadn't seen in months. She was leaning toward him, her face bright, flushed, and animated, her hand casually resting on his knee. I stood there, my entire body screaming for me to do something, anything. But I couldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place, paralyzed by disbelief. I should have barged in, demanded to know what was going on. Instead, I just watched as she leaned in closer, their eyes locked on each other like nothing else in the world mattered. It all made sense in that moment, all the late nights, the unexplained giggles over texts she wouldn't share. It was him, all along. I must have made some kind of noise, because suddenly Emily looked up. Her eyes went wide for a split second, fear, maybe, but then something else flashed across her face. Annoyance. Like I was the one intruding. Eric sat up straighter, but he didn't look guilty. No, he had the audacity to look amused, like this was all some big joke. Jack, Emily snapped, her voice sharp, like I had interrupted her. She stood up too quickly, almost knocking over the wine glass on the table. My mouth was dry, and I barely managed to choke out the words, "What's going on here, Em?" Her eyes rolled, and she actually sighed, as if I was being ridiculous. "It's not what you think, Jack," she said, her tone dismissive. Meanwhile, Eric stayed silent, glancing at her like he was waiting for his cue. The arrogance on his face made my fists clench. I took a step into the room, something inside me breaking. What am I supposed to think? I asked, louder this time, my voice shaking. "You're here with him, dressed like that, in our house." Emily crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You're being dramatic," she said coldly. "Eric just came over to talk about work. I didn't expect you home so early." Her voice had this clipped, irritated edge to it, like I had ruined her plans. No apology, no real explanation, just indifference. I couldn't believe it. She didn't even care enough to lie convincingly. She just stood there, looking at me like I was the inconvenience. "You think I'm stupid?" I growled, stepping closer, my voice rising. "I see what's going on. The late nights, the secret texts. You think I wouldn't notice?" Finally, Eric stood up, adjusting his jacket, but he didn't look at me. He looked at her, waiting for permission, like she was in charge. That was all I needed to see. The unspoken understanding between them was all the confirmation I needed. Emily turned to him, her voice softer now. "Maybe you should go, Eric." She was protecting him. Not me. Him. Eric nodded, barely glancing at me as he walked toward the door, that same smug look plastered on his face. I wanted to grab him, throw him out, make him regret ever stepping foot in my house, but I didn't. Because this fight wasn't with him. It was with her. As the door shut behind him, Emily let out a long sigh, like she was relieved he was gone. She turned back to me, her eyes narrowing. Jack, you're overreacting. There's nothing going on. If you can't trust me, then maybe we need to talk about that. I stared at her, feeling something inside me snap. She wasn't even pretending anymore. No remorse, no guilt, just arrogance, like she had already decided this was all my fault. I wasn't looking at the woman I married. I was looking at a stranger. A cold, selfish stranger who didn't care how much she hurt me. You think I'm going to let you blame me for this? I said, my voice low, but shaking with anger. You brought him into our home, lied to me for months, and now you want to make me the problem? She rolled her eyes again, like I was just some annoying little kid throwing a tantrum. You're always so dramatic, Jack. Nothing's going on between us. You just can't handle that I have friends outside of this marriage. Her words hit me like a slap. There was no shame in her voice, no regret, just contempt. That was when I realized it was over. Not just this conversation, but us. Whatever we had once been, it was gone, and there was no getting it back. You know what, Emily? I said, stepping back, my voice trembling. I'm done. She blinked, caught off guard for the first time that night. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice softer now, almost cautious. It means I'm done with this, I said, feeling the finality of the words settle over me. I'm not going to spend another day wondering if you're lying to me. I deserve better than this. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, fear, maybe, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. She just stood there, staring at me with that same cold, indifferent look. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. If that's what you want. I waited, hoping for something, anything, that might make me believe she still cared. But there was nothing. No apology, no attempt to fix things. Just her cold indifference. Yeah, I whispered, more to myself than to her. I guess it is. After that night, I moved into the guest room. It was the only thing I could do to keep my sanity. I didn't say much to Emily after our confrontation. There was nothing left to say, really. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. But the worst part was, even though I was done with her emotionally, I still had to see her every day, pretending like we were just two strangers sharing a house. I thought she might try to explain herself, maybe offer up some half-hearted apology or at least pretend to feel guilty. But Emily didn't. She carried on like nothing had happened. She still went to work, still stayed out late, and I barely saw her most days. When I did, she'd barely acknowledge me, like I was just a roommate she was tolerating. It was maddening. I'd come home from work, find her sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. She'd shoot me a quick glance, maybe offer a flat hey, and then go right back to whatever she was doing. No remorse. No explanation. Just apathy. One night, about a week after the whole thing with Eric, I walked into the living room to find her on the couch. She had her feet propped up, a glass of wine in one hand, and her laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the time she'd actually say something. Anything. But instead, she just gave me that same dismissive look and turned her attention back to her screen. Emily, I said, my voice tense, trying to keep myself calm. We need to talk about this. She didn't even look up. Talk about what? I clenched my jaw, my frustration boiling over. About us. About what happened. She sighed, like I was exhausting her. She set her glass down and finally looked at me, but there was no warmth in her eyes, just irritation. Jack, I told you. There's nothing to talk about. You're making a big deal out of nothing. I couldn't believe her. After everything, she was still going to stand there and pretend like none of it mattered? Like I was just being irrational? I stepped closer, trying to keep my voice steady. I saw you, Emily. I heard you. Do you really think I'm going to believe that nothing's going on with you and Eric? Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Eric is a friend, she said, her voice flat. I don't know what you think you saw, but it wasn't what you're making it out to be. There it was again, that same cold detachment, the same refusal to acknowledge what she had done. It was like she had rehearsed this response over and over again until she convinced herself it was true. But I wasn't falling for it. You expect me to believe that? I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. After all the lies, after all the late nights, you want me to just accept that nothing's going on? She sighed again, picking up her glass of wine and taking a slow sip before answering. Jack, I've told you 100 times, you're paranoid. You need to stop overthinking everything. Maybe if you didn't spend so much time obsessing over what I'm doing, you'd realize that this is all in your head. I felt something inside me crack. There she was, twisting everything around, making me the problem. Like I was the one who had been sneaking around, like I was the one who had ruined us. I couldn't take it anymore. Is that really what you think? I asked quietly, my voice shaking with frustration. That this is my fault? She rolled her eyes, clearly done with the conversation. I think you need to relax, she said, her tone condescending. You're making yourself miserable for no reason. That was it. I couldn't hold back any longer. No reason? I exploded, my voice rising. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with him, and you expect me to just sit back and relax? Do you even hear yourself, Emily? She didn't flinch, didn't react. She just stared at me, her face completely blank. I'm not doing this with you, she said, her voice cold. If you're not going to trust me, then that's your problem. But I'm not going to keep defending myself when I've done nothing wrong. The words hit me like a slap. She wasn't going to defend herself anymore. She wasn't going to fight for this. For us. It was like she had already moved on, like I was just an inconvenience standing in the way of her new life. I stood there, staring at her, trying to find some trace of the woman I had married. But she was gone. Whatever was left of Emily had disappeared, replaced by this cold and different stranger who didn't care if she tore me apart. I couldn't do it anymore. I'm done, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, raising an eyebrow. Done with what? Done with this. With you. With pretending like there's something left to save here. I could barely get the words out, but I meant them. For the first time that night, I saw something flicker in her eyes, surprise, maybe. Or maybe it was just disappointment that I wasn't going to keep playing her game. Either way, she didn't try to stop me. She just sat there, watching me, like this was all part of her plan. Fine, she said, shrugging. If that's what you want. It wasn't what I wanted. But it was what I needed. I turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, knowing that this was it. There was no going back now. The days after that conversation were tense. I slept in the guest room while Emily continued on like nothing had changed. I would leave for work before she got up, and by the time I came home, she was either out with friends or locked in our bedroom, glued to her phone. We didn't talk. We didn't argue. It was like we were ghosts haunting the same house, silently drifting past each other. One evening, about a week later, I decided I'd had enough of the silence. We couldn't keep avoiding the elephant in the room forever. Something had to give, and I wasn't going to let her keep dragging me through this mess without answers. I walked into the kitchen, where she was sitting with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I entered. That same dismissive attitude, the one that had been slowly driving me insane. I stood there for a moment, just watching her, trying to find the right words. But all I felt was frustration and exhaustion. Emily, I said, my voice steady, though I could feel the tension building in my chest. We need to talk. She didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge me at first. She just took another sip of her wine, her eyes still glued to the screen. About what? She asked, her voice dripping with boredom. About what's happening, I said, moving closer. About where we stand. You can't keep acting like this is normal. Finally, she put down her phone and gave me that cold, detached stare she'd perfected over the past few months. What do you want me to say, Jack? She asked, her tone laced with irritation. We already talked about this. There's nothing to say. Nothing to say? I repeated, incredulous. You're serious? You think you can just ignore everything that's been going on and pretend like it doesn't matter? She rolled her eyes, clearly done with the conversation before it had even started. What do you want from me, Jack? She snapped. I've told you 100 times, nothing's going on. You're just looking for something to be mad about. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was still playing the same game, still twisting everything around to make it look like I was the one losing my mind. You expect me to believe that? I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. After all the nights you've been out late, the texts you hide, Eric. Her eyes flashed with anger at his name, but she quickly regained control, shrugging like it didn't matter. I told you before, she said, her voice low and cold, Eric is just a friend. If you're too insecure to handle that, then maybe you're the one who needs to figure things out. I felt my fists clench at my sides, trying to keep the anger from boiling over. This wasn't about insecurity. This was about respect, something she clearly had none of left for me. This isn't about insecurity, I said through gritted teeth. This is about you lying to me. You've been lying for months, and you know it. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. I'm not going to do this again, she snapped, her voice sharp. If you don't trust me, then that's your problem. But I'm not going to stand here and be accused of something I didn't do. She grabbed her phone and started to walk out of the kitchen, but I stepped in front of her, blocking her way. No, we're not done, I said firmly. You can't keep running away every time I ask you what's going on. You owe me the truth. She stopped, her eyes narrowing. I don't owe you anything, Jack, she said, her voice venomous. Not after the way you've been treating me. I stared at her, stunned. Treating her? She was the one who had been sneaking around, lying to my face, and now she was turning it around on me? What the hell are you talking about? I demanded, my voice shaking with disbelief. I've been nothing but patient with you. You're the one who's been tearing us apart. Her lips curled into a cold, bitter smile. Maybe you're the one who tore us apart, Jack. Ever think of that? I stood there, my mind reeling. She wasn't just deflecting anymore, she was rewriting history. Making it seem like this was all my fault, like I had pushed her into whatever mess she was caught up in. I couldn't believe it. You really think that, don't you? I asked quietly, my voice filled with disbelief. You really think I'm the one who ruined us? She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes cold, indifferent, like she was already done with the conversation, with me, with us. That's when it hit me. She didn't care. She wasn't interested in fixing this, in fixing us. I had been holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. But the woman standing in front of me wasn't interested in any of that. She was done. And I realized, in that moment, so was I. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not going to keep fighting for something that's already dead. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't try to argue or stop me. She just stood there, watching me with those same cold, distant eyes. Then don't, she said flatly. I stood there for a second, waiting for something, anything, that might make me feel like this was the wrong decision. But there was nothing. Just the cold silence between us, the final nail in the coffin of whatever we once had. Fine, I said, my voice breaking. It's over. She didn't say a word. She just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, staring at the empty space where she had been. The day after I said it was over, something in me shifted. It was like the fog that had been clouding my mind for months had finally lifted. I wasn't second-guessing myself anymore. I wasn't waiting for Emily to explain herself, to offer up some excuse or apology. I knew, deep down, that she never would. And the more I accepted that, the more I realized I needed to move forward, for my own sanity. The house felt emptier, but in a way, that was a relief. There wasn't any more tension in the air, no more waiting for the next fight, the next lie. I stopped sleeping in the guest room and moved back into the master bedroom. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself, a part of my life that I had let slip away while I was too busy fighting for something that had already been lost. Emily didn't say much after our conversation. She spent more and more time away from the house, coming back late at night, barely acknowledging me. The mornings were quiet, she'd be gone before I even got up, and I'd come home to an empty house most nights. It was like she was slowly disappearing from my life, and honestly, I was okay with that. Every day, I felt a little more free, like I was shaking off the weight of the past few months. But as much as I was ready to let her go, there was one thing I couldn't ignore: Eric. That smug bastard had been part of this from the start, and I knew that if I didn't confront him, the anger boiling inside me would never go away. I couldn't let him walk away without facing me, without facing the damage he'd done to my life. One afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I knew where Eric worked. Hell, Emily had made sure I knew all about her work dinners with him. I drove to his office, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I wasn't leaving until I'd said my piece. I walked into the lobby of his building, my heart pounding in my chest. The receptionist greeted me with a forced smile, asking if I had an appointment. I gave her Eric's name, and she hesitated for a moment, probably sensing the tension rolling off me. "I'm here to see Eric Thompson," I said, my voice steady but firm. She gave me a polite nod and picked up the phone, calling up to his office. A few moments later, she put the receiver down and smiled at me. "He'll be right down." I stood there, feeling the anger simmering beneath the surface, waiting for him to show his face. And when the elevator doors finally opened, there he was, Eric, with that same smug look he always had, the one that made my blood boil. He walked over, his hands in his pockets, trying to look casual, like this was just another day at the office. "Jack," he said, with a slight nod, "didn't expect to see you here." I could hear the arrogance in his voice, the way he didn't even bother pretending to be sorry. He didn't respect me. Hell, he didn't even respect Emily. To him, this whole thing was probably just a game. "You know why I'm here," I said, my voice low and cold. He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "I'm guessing you want to talk about Emily." The way he said her name made my fists clench. "You don't get to say her name," I growled, stepping closer. "You don't get to talk about her, or me, or anything. You think you can just walk into my life, wreck my marriage, and get away with it?" Eric shrugged, unfazed by the anger in my voice. "Look, Jack," he said, his tone condescending, "things happen. People change. Relationships fall apart. It's not my fault if your marriage wasn't strong enough to handle that." I stared at him, feeling the rage boiling over. He was actually trying to justify what he'd done, like he was doing me a favor, pointing out the flaws in my life. "You think this is about my marriage?" I snapped, my voice rising. "This is about you. You had no right to interfere. You had no right to come into my house and act like you belonged there." Eric gave me that same smirk, the one that made me want to punch him in the face. "Look, man," he said, "Emily made her choices. She came to me. You're just mad because you couldn't keep her." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I wasn't going to let him see that. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under my skin. I took a step closer, my voice steady but sharp. "You think you've won something here?" I asked, my eyes locked on his. "You think this is a game? Trust me, Eric, you're not the first guy she's done this with. And you sure as hell won't be the last." For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, uncertainty, maybe even fear. But then the smirk returned, and he shrugged again. "We'll see," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. I stared at him, knowing there was no point in arguing. Eric wasn't worth my time, and he sure as hell wasn't worth my anger. He wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to apologize. He was a selfish, arrogant bastard who thought he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. "Enjoy it while it lasts," I said, turning to leave. "Because when she gets bored of you, she'll move on to the next guy. And you'll be nothing but a footnote in her life." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of that office, my heart still pounding, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had taken back control. I had said what I needed to say, and now it was done. On the drive home, I realized that I didn't need to fight anymore. Not for Emily, not for my pride, and certainly not for Eric's respect. I was done with all of them. They could have each other, and whatever twisted version of happiness they thought they'd found. As I pulled into the driveway, the house felt different. It wasn't just a place full of memories anymore. It was mine, and I was finally ready to start living without the weight of Emily's betrayal dragging me down. After confronting Eric, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, like I had finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying for months. It wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about me, about reclaiming my life, my sanity, and moving on from the wreckage she'd left behind. I started focusing on things I had neglected during the mess of the last few months. The house, for one. I spent a weekend clearing out all the clutter, every piece of furniture, every little trinket that reminded me of us. I put her things in boxes and stacked them in the garage, ready for her to pick up whenever she decided to show her face. It wasn't about getting rid of memories, it was about making space for something new, something that was mine. The more I cleared out, the lighter I felt. I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I wasn't waiting for her to apologize, or explain, or make things right. Emily was gone, and with every box I moved out of the house, I realized I didn't need her, or the version of myself I had been when I was with her, anymore. A couple of weeks passed before I heard from her again. I had half expected her to come back, pleading for another chance, but she never did. The text I got from her was short and to the point: "I'm coming by to get my stuff this weekend." There was no apology, no attempt at closure. Just another cold, detached message. And I was fine with that. In a way, it was the perfect ending to what we had become, two people who used to mean everything to each other, now reduced to impersonal texts and the division of property. The weekend came, and she showed up early Saturday morning. I was in the garage when I saw her pull into the driveway. She stepped out of her car, looking the same as ever, confident, put together, like the past few months hadn't touched her at all. It was strange, seeing her in person after everything that had happened. For a split second, I felt that old familiar pull, the part of me that used to love her, the part that wanted to fix things. But that part of me was quieter now, almost silent. She walked over to the garage, her eyes sweeping over the boxes I had packed for her. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at the remnants of her old life, the life we had built together. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd say something, some acknowledgement of what we'd lost. But when she finally spoke, her voice was as cold as ever. "Is this all of it?" she asked, glancing at me. I nodded. "Yeah. That's it." She didn't look at me as she started loading the boxes into her car. There was no small talk, no attempt to smooth things over. It was just business. I stood there, watching her for a moment, trying to figure out if there was anything left to say. But there wasn't. I'd said everything that mattered, and so had she. Now, all that was left was the final act of separation. When she was done, she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I guess this is it, then." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of finality settle over me. "Yeah. I guess it is." She looked at me for a second longer, as if she was waiting for me to say something more, but I didn't. And neither did she. She just nodded, got into her car, and drove away without looking back. I stood there in the driveway for a while after she left, watching the dust settle on the road. And that was when it really hit me, it was over. Not just the marriage, but the part of my life where I had been stuck in limbo, waiting for something to change. Emily was gone, and she wasn't coming back. But the thing was, I didn't need her to. That evening, I sat on the couch in my now empty house, sipping a beer and looking around at the space I had reclaimed for myself. It didn't feel empty, though. It felt peaceful. Like I could finally breathe again. In the weeks that followed, I started rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy. Letting go of someone you've loved, someone you thought you'd spend your life with, is never simple. But day by day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. I reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work, and started rediscovering the things I used to love before everything fell apart. The biggest change, though, was that I stopped looking back. There was a time when every memory, every corner of the house reminded me of Emily, of what we had lost. But now, those memories didn't hurt as much. They were just part of my story, part of the past. And I was ready to move forward. One night, a few months after she had left for good, I found myself sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was one of those quiet, golden evenings, where everything feels still and calm. I thought about Emily for the first time in a while, but not with anger or regret. Just with acceptance. She had been a part of my life, a big part, but she wasn't the whole story. I had a future ahead of me, one that didn't involve her. And for the first time in what felt like forever, that future felt wide open. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. I wasn't waiting for answers anymore. I wasn't waiting for her to come back, or for an apology that would never come. I was finally free.